I stepped into the living room, still wearing the black dress from the funeral. The faint scent of lilies clinging to my coat like something that refused to let go. The house felt colder than the cemetery had, though the windows were shut and the fireplace glowed faintly against the far wall. Everyone was already there. My cousins lined the sofa like judges waiting for a verdict. Daniel leaned against the fireplace with a glass of bourbon in his hand. His shoulders relaxed in that careless way he always had when he believed he owned the room. The moment he saw me walk in, his mouth curved into a smirk that made something old and familiar tighten in my chest. On the coffee table sat a stack of untouched condolence cards, their envelopes still sealed. As if sympathy itself had become a performance nobody cared enough to finish. I placed my leather folder on the center table. Daniel let out a quiet laugh. "There's probably nothing in there for you," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. A few of them chuckled, the sound thin and sharp. No one defended me. I didn't answer him. Instead, I pulled out my phone, checked the time, and said calmly, "My lawyer will be here any minute." And that was the moment the room went still, not because they respected me, but because, for the first time in my life, they realized I had come prepared. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was tight and watchful, like the air before a thunderstorm. I stood there for a second longer, letting the quiet stretch, before slipping off my coat and draping it neatly over the back of a chair. My hands didn't shake. I noticed that I expected them to, after burying Uncle Richard just hours earlier, after standing beside his grave while the wind tugged at the black ribbon pinned to my collar. But my hands were steady. Strange what grief does. It settles into you like a stone, heavy but still, leaving everything else sharp and clear. Earlier that morning, the cemetery had been calm in a way that felt respectful. Gray sky, damp earth. A small group gathered close together, speaking in soft voices that carried sympathy but little warmth. Daniel had shaken hands like he was greeting business partners. Lorraine had dabbed her eyes carefully, never once letting her mascara smudge. I remembered standing beside the casket, listening to the pastor speak about legacy and loyalty, wondering if anyone else there understood what those words truly meant. Now, inside the house, the difference was impossible to ignore. The funeral had felt solemn. This felt hostile. Daniel took a slow sip of bourbon, never taking his eyes off me. Lorraine sat upright on the sofa, her purse clutched tightly in her lap, fingers woven through the strap as if it anchored her to the moment. Two younger cousins sat near the armrest, whispering to each other until I entered. The moment I crossed the doorway, their voices died instantly. Someone had been talking about me. That wasn't new. It had been that way for most of my life. Daniel had always been the favorite, the one trusted with numbers, the one invited into conversations that happened behind closed doors. Even as children, the difference was obvious. He got praised for ambition. I got praised for patience. Patience. That word followed me through decades like a shadow. When Uncle Richard needed someone to help organize paperwork, I was called. When he needed groceries delivered, I was available. When his health began slipping and his world grew smaller, I was the one who drove across town every week, sometimes twice, sitting beside him at the kitchen table while he sorted envelopes and receipts with careful hands. The rest of the family visited on holidays. I visited on ordinary Tuesdays. And somehow, ordinary had never counted for much in this family. Daniel cleared his throat loudly, pulling me back into the present. "So," he said, glancing at the folder on the table, "you planning to read us bedtime stories?" "Margaret." A few quiet laughs followed, softer this time, uncertain. I didn't react. I simply stood beside the table, watching them the way I had watched people for years, quietly, carefully, noticing details others ignored. Lorraine avoided my eyes entirely. Marcus, seated near the far armchair, shifted in his seat, tapping his fingers against his knee in a nervous rhythm that didn't match the calm expression on his face. Someone finally asked, "Why would you even have documents already?" The question hung in the air longer than expected, because that was the part none of them understood. I had known this day would come. Not in an emotional way, loss always arrives heavier than expected, but in a practical way. Uncle Richard had never been careless. He prepared for things long before anyone else noticed they were coming. Months earlier, he had handed me a sealed envelope one evening after dinner. "Keep this somewhere safe," he had said, sliding it across the table toward me. I remembered staring at it, confused. "What's in it?" "Instructions," he replied. "Not for now. For later." There had been something in his voice that night, something steady but serious enough to make me listen without arguing. I had taken the envelope home and placed it in my desk drawer, untouched, exactly as he instructed. Now, standing in this room full of people who had spent years assuming I was insignificant, I understood why. The room shifted slightly as Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You always liked paperwork," he said. "Guess you finally found a use for it." His voice carried that same old tone, condescending, dismissive, familiar. But beneath it, I heard something new, unease. Before I could respond, a sound cut cleanly through the tension. The doorbell rang. Sharp. Unexpected. Every head turned at once. Daniel froze mid-motion, glass still in his hand. Lorraine straightened, her back stiff, fingers tightening around her purse strap. No one spoke. Not a single whisper. I moved toward the door slowly, aware of their eyes following every step I took. The hallway felt longer than usual, the air heavier with each footfall. When I reached the door, I paused for just a second, resting my hand against the handle. Then I opened it. Michael Bennett stood on the front step, his dark coat buttoned neatly, a leather briefcase held firmly at his side. His expression was calm, professional, unreadable. Authority walked in with him. "Good afternoon, Margaret," he said quietly. "Thank you for coming," I replied. He stepped inside, removing his gloves with measured movements, as if nothing about this moment was unusual. But behind me, the room had gone completely silent again. As we returned to the living room together, every eye locked onto the briefcase in his hand. Michael Bennett didn't rush. He walked to the table, placed the briefcase down carefully, and opened it with slow, deliberate precision. Inside was a sealed envelope, heavy paper, formal seal pressed deep into its surface. He placed it at the center of the table, directly between all of us. And suddenly, the same people who had ignored me for years leaned forward, not because they cared about me, but because they were terrified of what might be inside. Michael Bennett rested his hands on either side of the sealed envelope, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. No one dared speak. Even Daniel, who had always filled quiet moments with arrogance, stood unusually still, his bourbon glass frozen halfway to his lips. The envelope sat there like something alive, thick paper pressed with a deep, official seal that caught the light from the chandelier above us. I watched Michael carefully as he slid a finger beneath the edge of the seal. He didn't rush. He never rushed. That hesitation alone made the room tighten. Lorraine shifted beside the sofa, her purse still clutched tightly against her chest. Marcus leaned forward as if proximity might somehow change the outcome. Someone behind me exhaled sharply, but no one spoke. The sound of paper breaking open echoed louder than it should have. Michael withdrew several documents from the envelope, placing them neatly on the table in precise alignment. His movements were methodical, almost ceremonial. Then he began to read. In accordance with the final will and testament of Richard Calloway, the legal language filled the room, steady and formal, detached from emotion. I barely heard the first few sentences. My attention stayed fixed on the faces around me. Daniel's jaw was clenched. Lorraine stared at the papers like she was trying to read them from across the room. Michael continued. "The following provisions are to be executed as written, without alteration or delay." He paused briefly, adjusting the top sheet. Then he spoke the next line. "The primary beneficiary named in this document is Margaret Calloway." My name landed in the center of the room like a dropped glass. Daniel blinked once, sharply. "That must be procedural," he said quickly, his voice too loud, too forced. You know how these things read, alphabetical order or whatever nonsense they use. Michael didn't even look up. He simply continued reading. To Margaret Calloway, I bequeath the sum of $88 million. The words seemed to hang in the air, suspended. For a moment, nobody reacted. Then the whispers began. What? That can't be right. Lorraine leaned forward suddenly, her composure cracking at the edges. Michael continued without pause. As well as full controlling interest in the commercial property located at 47th Street, Manhattan, including all associated management authority. This time, there was no mistaking the reaction. Daniel let out a short, disbelieving laugh. That's impossible, he said. There has to be some mistake. His voice wasn't mocking now. It was strained. Lorraine shook her head slowly. Richard would never... Michael raised his hand slightly, silencing her without looking up. He finished the sentence calmly. These provisions are to take effect immediately upon certification of this document. Silence followed. Heavy, suffocating silence. I didn't move. I didn't celebrate. I didn't even breathe differently. Instead, I felt something else entirely. Weight. Responsibility pressing against my ribs like a hand closing slowly around my chest. Across the room, Daniel stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. Not as family. Not as background noise. As a problem. Michael carefully turned to the next sheet. There is an additional provision attached to this inheritance. The tension shifted instantly. Daniel straightened. Lorraine leaned forward again. What provision? She asked. Unable to stop herself, Michael glanced at her briefly, then returned his attention to the page. The recipient of the Manhattan property must assume operational control of said property within 30 days of this reading. The words felt heavier than the money itself. Failure to do so, Michael continued, will result in temporary administrative reassignment to the overseeing trust authority. Daniel let out a low whistle. 30 days, he muttered. Lorraine's voice sharpened. That's unreasonable. But Michael continued, ignoring both of them. This condition is binding. I stood there absorbing the meaning of it. Not just inheritance. Responsibility. Expectation. Uncle Richard had never believed in gifts without purpose. Every dollar had meaning. Every decision carried weight. A memory flickered quietly at the edge of my mind. Years earlier, he had sat across from me at the kitchen table, tapping a pen against a stack of documents. Ownership isn't reward, he had said. It's duty. At the time, I hadn't fully understood what he meant. Now I did. Michael lifted another sheet from the stack. This one looked different. Thicker paper. Smaller font. He hesitated before reading. That hesitation did something strange to the room. Even Daniel noticed. Michael cleared his throat. There is an additional statement regarding financial activity recorded in the final 6 months of Mr. Calloway's life. Lorraine's fingers tightened visibly. Daniel didn't move at all. In that period, Michael continued, multiple unauthorized attempts were made to access restricted financial accounts. The words landed harder than the inheritance itself. Unauthorized. Attempts. Access. The room went still in a different way this time. Not shocked. Afraid. Michael continued calmly. These attempts were documented and flagged by internal security measures. My pulse slowed instead of racing. Because suddenly, something began forming in my memory. A moment months ago, Uncle Richard sitting quietly at the kitchen table. Phone lighting up, his expression tightening for just a second before smoothing over. Routine banking, he had said back then. But now, standing in this room, hearing these words, it didn't feel routine anymore. Someone finally spoke. Are you saying someone here did something illegal? The question came from Marcus. Too fast, too defensive. Michael didn't answer directly. Instead, he reached into his briefcase once more. From inside, he removed a smaller sealed packet. This one marked differently. Red ink across the front. Appendix, He placed it on the table and slid it toward me. Not toward Daniel. Not toward Lorraine. Toward me. This section contains supporting documentation, he said quietly. Lorraine leaned forward again. What kind of documentation? Her voice carried strain now, thin and sharp. Michael didn't answer her. I stared at the packet in front of me. The paper felt heavier than it should have when I touched it. Not because of what it weighed, but because of what it meant. For the first time since the funeral ended, I realized something far more dangerous than inheritance was about to be revealed. Not money, not property, but proof. Michael didn't open the appendix right away. Instead, he let his hand rest on top of the sealed packet, pressing it lightly against the table as if weighing the moment. The red lettering across the front seemed darker now, sharper against the white paper. There is an additional appendix that must be read aloud, he said. Lorraine leaned forward, her voice tight. What appendix? No one answered her. Michael slid a finger beneath the seal, tearing it slowly. The sound of paper breaking felt louder than anything else in the room. Even Daniel stopped breathing loudly enough to hear. He unfolded the first page carefully. In the final 6 months of Richard Calloway's life, he began. Multiple unauthorized attempts were made to access restricted financial accounts under his ownership. A ripple of confusion moved across the room. Unauthorized attempts. Not mistakes. Not accidents. Attempts. These attempts, Michael continued, were documented, flagged, and preserved as part of ongoing financial security monitoring. Daniel didn't move. Lorraine's fingers tightened visibly around the strap of her purse, pulling the leather into a deep crease. And suddenly, without warning, a memory rose in my mind so clearly that it felt like stepping into another room. Months earlier, I had been sitting at Uncle Richard's kitchen table while he sorted paperwork beneath the warm yellow light above the sink. The house had smelled faintly of coffee and lemon cleaner, a scent that always reminded me of long evenings spent helping him organize his files. His phone buzzed against the table. He glanced down. For just a second, his expression changed, barely noticeable, but sharp enough to catch my attention. What is it? I had asked. Routine banking, he replied. But his voice hadn't sounded routine. It had sounded careful. Later that same night, as I stood near the door preparing to leave, he asked me something that made little sense at the time. Have you noticed anyone asking unusual questions lately? I remember frowning. Questions about what? Accounts, he said. Paperwork. Anything that feels out of place. I had shaken my head. Confused. At the time, I assumed it was caution, his usual careful nature showing itself again. Standing in the living room now, hearing Michael read those words aloud, that memory felt different. It felt like warning. Michael continued reading. These access attempts were made using credentials that were either expired, restricted, or unauthorized. No one spoke, but I could feel the tension shifting around me. Marcus shifted in his chair, his fingers tapping rapidly against his knee. Lorraine stared down at the floor as if something there demanded her full attention. Daniel stood perfectly still. Too still. Are you saying someone here tried to steal from him? Marcus asked suddenly. His voice cracked slightly at the end of the sentence. Michael didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned another page. Due to the suspicious nature of these attempts, additional safeguards were implemented immediately. His tone remained steady, controlled, professional. New account permissions were created. Transaction logs were expanded. All financial movement was recorded in full detail. The words felt heavier with each sentence. Documented. Recorded. Preserved. Evidence. Michael paused briefly before adding, all activity during this period was archived. Archived. That single word echoed in my mind. He reached into his briefcase once more, his movements slow and deliberate. This time, he withdrew something small, so small that at first I didn't understand what it was. A key. Metal. Simple in shape but worn along the edges, as if handled countless times. Attached to it was a faded tag. He turned toward me, Your uncle instructed me to give this to you, he said. He placed the key in my hand. The metal felt unexpectedly heavy against my palm. Not physically heavy. Symbolically heavy. Daniel stepped forward slightly, unable to hide his reaction. What records? He asked, his voice sharper than before. Michael didn't look at him. Instead, he spoke quietly, directing his words toward me. These records may explain why your uncle became increasingly cautious in his final months. A strange chill moved through my chest. Not fear. Recognition. Lorraine leaned forward again. What kind of records? She demanded. Her voice sounded strained now, stretched thin beneath something she couldn't fully hide. Michael lowered his voice slightly. Private records, he said. The room fell silent again. I turned the key slowly between my fingers, feeling its ridged edges press into my skin. Something about its shape stirred another memory, one I hadn't thought about in years. Late one evening, months before his health began to decline, I had arrived at Uncle Richard's house unannounced. The front door had been unlocked, and I stepped inside quietly, calling his name. No answer. I found him in the study, standing near the far wall, locking a cabinet. He moved quickly when he noticed me, slipping the key into his pocket before turning around. Just organizing? He said. I hadn't questioned it. I never questioned him. Now, standing in this living room surrounded by people who suddenly looked smaller than they had just hours ago, that memory carried new meaning. Something had been hidden. Not forgotten. Hidden. Michael began gathering the remaining documents, sliding them neatly back into his briefcase. The reading was finished, but the tension remained. No one spoke. Daniel stared at the key in my hand like it belonged to him, like something had been taken that he believed was already his. Lorraine sat motionless, her lips pressed tightly together. I lowered my gaze to the key again. That was when I noticed it. Tiny numbers engraved along the edge, so small they were almost invisible unless the light hit them at the right angle. Not random scratches. Not wear. Numbers. Precise. Intentional. I tilted the key slightly, letting the light reflect across the metal surface. There were 5 digits. Ordered. Deliberate. And suddenly, the room around me faded into the background as a new realization settled in. This key didn't just open a cabinet. It unlocked something far bigger. Something hidden long before any of us walked into that living room today. As I closed my hand around the key, a single thought pressed heavily against my mind. Whatever waited behind that lock, Uncle Richard had trusted me to find it. The wind cut sharply between the tall buildings as I stepped onto 47th Street, pulling my coat tighter around me. Manhattan always moved with urgency, horns blaring, footsteps echoing, conversations spilling into the cold air. But that morning, everything felt strangely distant, like the city existed behind a sheet of glass. I stopped across the street and looked up. The building stood taller than I expected, its stone facade weathered but proud, windows rising in clean vertical lines that reflected the gray sky above. Uncle Richard's name remained etched beside the entrance in polished brass, untouched, unaltered, as if time itself had paused here. He had built something that lasted, and now it belonged to me. Not in theory, not on paper. In reality. That thought didn't fill me with pride. It filled me with responsibility. Inside the lobby, the air smelled faintly of old carpet and furniture polish. The lighting felt dimmer than it should have been. The corners of the room shadowed in ways that made the space feel smaller than it was. A man stood behind the reception desk, flipping through a stack of papers. He looked up the moment I stepped inside. Recognition flashed across his face before he masked it with professionalism. Mrs. Calloway? He asked. Yes, I replied. He stepped forward quickly, extending his hand. Thomas Keller, building manager. His handshake was firm but colder than expected. Not unfriendly, just cautious. Too cautious. I was told you might come, he said. There was something odd in the way he phrased it. Might come. Not expected. Not scheduled. Might? Who told you that? I asked. Thomas hesitated for just a second, barely noticeable. But enough. They said, he paused again, lowering his voice slightly. They said you might never come. The words settled heavily between us. Never come. Someone had expected me to stay away. Someone had counted on it. I nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch before speaking again. I'd like to see the operational floors, I said. Of course, he replied quickly. We walked toward the elevator together. The hum of machinery echoed faintly as the doors slid open. And we stepped inside without speaking. The ride upward felt longer than it should have. Too quiet. Too still. When the doors opened, a long hallway stretched ahead of us. Several office doors lined the walls. Some closed, others slightly ajar. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, flickering at irregular intervals. Occupancy is lower than usual, Thomas said carefully. I glanced through one open doorway. Empty desks, chairs pushed slightly askew, dust visible along the edges of filing cabinets. How long has it been like this? I asked. Some time, he answered. Not a number. Not specific. Vague. That alone made my suspicion sharpen. We continued walking. At the end of the hallway, a metal door caught my attention. Unlike the others, it remained firmly shut. A rectangular sign bolted to its center. Archive storage. Authorized access only. I stopped walking. Thomas noticed immediately. That room hasn't been used in years, he said quickly. Too quickly. My gaze shifted downward. Dust coated the floor along the hallway edges, but not near the door. There, faint impressions marked the surface. Footprints, fresh enough to disturb the settled dust. Someone had been inside recently. I turned back toward Thomas. You said it hasn't been used in years, I said. His expression tightened slightly. It's mostly inactive. He corrected. Mostly. Another vague word. Another small crack in the story. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folded appendix document Michael had given me the night before. My fingers moved steadily as I opened the page and traced the line printed near the bottom. Private Archive Access, Level B. The words sat clearly on the page. I need to enter this room, I said. Thomas swallowed visibly before nodding. Of course. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a ring of keys. The metal clinked softly as he searched through them, his fingers trembling just enough to betray his nerves. When he found the right key, he inserted it into the lock. The metal scraped softly, then clicked. The door opened with a long, reluctant creak. The smell hit first. Dust. Old paper. Closed air. The room beyond stretched deeper than expected, lined with tall metal cabinets and storage boxes stacked in careful rows. A thin layer of dust coated most surfaces, undisturbed in wide patches. But not everywhere. Near the center of the room, the dust showed clear disruption, movement, activity. Recent. I stepped inside slowly. Thomas followed behind me but stayed close to the door, as if unwilling to venture too far. My eyes scanned the cabinets until one object caught my attention. A large ledger book sat alone on a metal table near the back wall. Not stored. Displayed. Waiting. I approached it carefully, brushing a thin layer of dust aside before opening the cover. The pages inside were thick, yellowed slightly with age. Rows of handwritten entries stretched across each line. Dates. Figures. Initials written with deliberate precision. Some entries were marked in black ink, others in red. Red stood out sharply against the faded paper. I turned the pages slowly. Dates stretched back years. Far longer than I expected. Decades. My breath slowed as recognition began to form. Certain initials appeared repeatedly, grouped near specific transaction notes. Patterns. Not random. Intentional. Then I saw it. Not initials. A full name. Daniel. Written clearly across multiple entries. Beside amounts. Transfers. Adjustments. My fingers froze against the page. That name appeared again. And again. Not once. Not twice. Repeated across months, years, tied to movements that made no sense within normal operations. Some of the dates aligned with periods long before Uncle Richard's health began failing, which meant this had started earlier. Much earlier. Behind me, Thomas shifted uncomfortably. There were instructions, he said quietly. I didn't look up. Instructions from who? I asked. He hesitated. Someone claiming authority. Authority. That word carried weight. What kind of instructions? To restrict certain access points, he said slowly. To prevent outside auditors from reviewing archived materials. That wasn't routine management. That was interference. I turned another page, scanning the entries more carefully now. My chest tightened as the pattern became undeniable. This wasn't mismanagement. This was planning. Careful. Deliberate. Hidden. A memory flickered at the edge of my mind. Uncle Richard standing in his study late at night, locking a cabinet before turning away as if nothing unusual had happened. At the time, I had trusted his silence. Now I understood it. He hadn't been hiding secrets. He had been protecting them. I closed the ledger slowly and lifted it into my hands. The weight felt enormous. Not because of paper. Because of truth. When we finally stepped back into the hallway, the air felt colder than before. Sharper. More dangerous. As I exited the building minutes later, the noise of Manhattan returned all at once. Cars. Horns. Voices blending into the familiar chaos of the city. But something else caught my attention. Across the street, a black sedan sat idling near the curb. Engine running. Windows tinted dark. No visible movement inside. Yet something about its stillness felt intentional. Watching. Waiting. I slowed my steps slightly, pretending not to notice as I approached my car. But just before opening the door, I glanced back once more at the building towering above me. And for the first time since the funeral, a realization settled deep into my chest. This was never just about inheritance. It was about control. And someone inside my own family had already been using that control long before I arrived. The ledger sat on my kitchen table long after the city outside had gone quiet. I hadn't turned on the overhead lights. Only the small lamp near the corner of the table glowed, casting a circle of yellow light across the worn leather cover. Everything beyond that circle faded into shadow, as if the rest of the room had stepped back to give the moment space. I set my coat aside and pulled out a chair. For several seconds, I didn't touch the ledger at all. I simply stared at it. Because now, it wasn't just paper. It was history. Carefully written history that someone had hoped would stay buried. Earlier that afternoon, as I left the Manhattan building, Thomas had walked me to the entrance. Just before I stepped outside, he leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping low enough that no one else could hear. "Be careful who you trust," he said. Not dramatic, not whispered with fear. Just quiet, certain, and deeply unsettling. Now, sitting alone in my kitchen, those words echoed louder than the ticking clock on the wall. I opened the ledger slowly. The leather creaked faintly as the cover lifted. The pages inside felt heavier than ordinary paper, thick with years of careful writing. Dates lined each row, stretching back further than I expected, far beyond recent years. Far beyond Uncle Richard's illness. Some entries were dated long before my own marriage. That realization settled heavily in my chest. This had been happening for years. Not months. Years. I traced one line carefully with my finger. Numbers recorded in neat columns. Transfers logged in deliberate sequence. Certain names appeared again and again, initials mostly. Short and precise. Then my hand froze. One name wasn't abbreviated. It wasn't hidden behind letters. It was written fully. Lorraine. My aunt's name appeared clearly in black ink beside a series of withdrawal notes. Not once. Multiple times. Each entry spaced weeks apart. Measured. Controlled. My breath slowed. At first, I told myself there had to be an explanation. Some legitimate role. Some authorized access. But the deeper I read, the harder that explanation became to believe. Her name appeared again several pages later. And again, each time linked to movements that didn't match routine expenses. Not maintenance. Not payroll. Transfers. Strategic ones. My fingers tightened around the edge of the page. A memory began forming, one I hadn't thought about in years. I saw Lorraine sitting at Uncle Richard's dining table. Years earlier. A stack of neatly arranged documents spread before her. She had always presented herself as helpful, organized, dependable. Richard. These processes are far too complicated, she had said calmly. You should simplify things. Let me help you streamline the paperwork. Her tone had been gentle, convincing. She spoke the language of efficiency, of responsibility. At the time, I believed her intentions were sincere. Most of us did. Uncle Richard had allowed her limited access to certain records, nothing major, nothing permanent, just small permissions meant to make daily operations smoother. At least, that's what we believed. But now, staring at her name repeating across years of transactions, that memory felt different. Not helpful, strategic, calculated. I turned another page slowly, and that was when I saw it. Another familiar name? Daniel. Written beside multiple entries marked in red ink. Red, not black. Marked differently. Highlighted. Warning signs I hadn't recognized before. The entries tied to his name followed a pattern, small adjustments made months apart. Never large enough to attract attention, but frequent enough to reshape the totals over time. Not theft. Not obvious fraud. Planning. Careful planning. My throat tightened as realization settled into place. Family dinners flashed through my mind. Long tables. Polished dishes. Laughter echoing across rooms filled with comfortable conversation. All those years, they had smiled, shared stories, passed plates across the table. And behind those smiles, something else had been happening. Something hidden. Something intentional. I leaned back in the chair, pressing my palms against my eyes for a moment. Not to cry, to think, because suddenly, the past looked different. Every moment of exclusion began rearranging itself in my memory. Every time Lorraine insisted I didn't need to attend financial discussions. Every time Daniel joked that I preferred simple responsibilities. Every polite dismissal. Every quiet redirection. They hadn't excluded me by accident. They had excluded me on purpose. A sharp ringing sound broke through the silence. The phone. I lowered my hands and reached for it slowly. My heart steady despite the tension pressing against my ribs. Michael Bennett's name flashed across the screen. I answered immediately. Margaret, he said without greeting. His voice sounded tighter than usual. We have a situation. The words landed heavier than expected. What kind of situation? A legal notice was filed this evening, he said. A formal challenge against the will. I closed my eyes briefly. Of course they had. What are they claiming? I asked. Undue influence, he replied. They're arguing that you manipulated Richard before his death. The accusation felt absurd, cruel, and entirely predictable. They're trying to invalidate the will, he continued. If successful, they could delay control of the assets indefinitely. Delay. Control. Pressure. That was the strategy. Not victory. Exhaustion. Wear me down until I surrendered. I looked back at the ledger lying open on the table. Evidence. Not suspicion anymore. Proof. This was never random, I said quietly. Michael paused. What do you mean? I turned the final pages of the ledger slowly, my fingertips brushing against the thick paper until I reached the very back. That was when I noticed it. One last page. Sealed. Different from the others. Edges glued shut. Hidden. Waiting. I said softly, staring at that sealed page. They didn't just make mistakes. My fingers hovered over the paper, hesitating for the first time since I opened the book. They planned this. I finished. Silence filled the line. Then Michael spoke again. Margaret, whatever's on that page, don't open it alone. I didn't answer right away, because something inside me had already changed. This wasn't about money anymore, or inheritance. or control. It was about truth. The kind of truth people spend years trying to bury. I touched the sealed edge of the final page carefully, and for the first time since opening the ledger, I understood something with perfect clarity. The real inheritance wasn't the money. It was the evidence they never expected me to find. The envelope arrived just after sunrise. I heard the mail slot snap open downstairs, the sound echoing sharply through the quiet house. For a moment, I stayed seated at the kitchen table, staring at the sealed page in the ledger that still lay untouched in front of me. Something in my chest tightened. Not fear. Expectation. I stood slowly and walked toward the front door, each step heavier than the last. When I opened it, the morning air slipped inside, cold and sharp against my skin. A large certified envelope rested on the floor just inside the doorway. Official. Heavy. Intentional. I bent down and picked it up, turning it carefully in my hands. The return address sat printed neatly in the upper corner. A legal firm. One I recognized immediately. Daniel's legal firm. That alone told me everything I needed to know before opening it. I carried the envelope back into the kitchen and placed it on the table beside the ledger. For several seconds, I simply stared at it, feeling the quiet pressure of inevitability settle into the room. Then I slid a finger beneath the seal and opened it. The paper inside unfolded stiffly. Crisp and formal, legal language stretched across the page in dense paragraphs, each sentence colder than the last. By the time I reached the center of the document, the message was clear. A lawsuit had been filed. Not implied. Not threatened. Filed. Formal challenge against the will. The accusation rested plainly in the text. Undue influence. They claimed I had manipulated Uncle Richard in his final months, pressured him into rewriting his will, and positioned myself as the primary beneficiary through deception. I let out a slow breath, folding the paper back along its original crease. Of course they had done this. They didn't want the truth. They wanted control. My phone buzzed before I could set the document down. Michael Bennett. I answered immediately. I received the notice. I said, I expected you would. He replied calmly. Meet me at my office within the hour. His voice carried urgency, but not panic. That alone steadied me. Less than an hour later, I sat across from him inside his office, surrounded by towering shelves filled with leather-bound legal volumes. The air smelled faintly of paper and polished wood, the scent of decades spent building cases and dismantling lies. Michael studied me carefully before speaking. This isn't emotional, he said. It's tactical. I nodded. I figured, they're trying to delay control of the estate, he continued. Freeze operational authority. Create pressure until you either make a mistake or give up. Give up. That word lingered longer than the rest. They won't win, he added quietly. But they will make this difficult. I leaned back slightly, letting his words settle. What happens next? Michael reached across his desk and slid another stack of documents toward me. These, he said, tapping the top page, are the protective structures your uncle created. I opened the folder carefully. Inside were diagrams, legal frameworks, trust records, layered structures connecting assets in ways I had never imagined. This is more than a will, Michael explained. It's a multi-layered trust system. I flipped through the pages slowly. Each section revealed new complexity. Separate holdings, restricted accounts, protected ownership chains. My chest tightened as realization began forming. He built all this in advance, I murmured. Yes, Michael replied. Long before his health declined, meaning he hadn't reacted to danger. He had anticipated it. A strange sense of respect washed through me. Not just admiration, understanding. He had seen something long before the rest of us noticed. Later that afternoon, as I returned home, the silence inside the house felt heavier than before. Papers covered the kitchen table now, spread across the surface like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. Outside, the sky darkened with approaching rain. I sat alone, studying the documents, tracing lines that connected properties to accounts. Accounts to trusts. Trusts to legal protections. Every piece led back to one central realization. Uncle Richard hadn't trusted the family. He had trusted the structure. And he had trusted me. A memory surfaced suddenly. Him sitting at the far end of the kitchen table months earlier, reviewing documents late into the evening. He looked tired that night, but determined. Protection always looks excessive, he had said quietly, until the moment it becomes necessary. At the time, I had smiled politely, assuming it was another lesson in caution. Now, it sounded like prophecy. My phone rang again just after dusk. Michael's number flashed across the screen. "This just came in," he said without greeting. "They filed an emergency motion." My grip tightened around the phone. "For what?" "To suspend your operational control temporarily," he replied. "They're trying to stop you from managing the Manhattan property." Of course they were. If they couldn't take control directly, they would stall it. Delay. Obstruct. Wear me down. "How long do we have?" I asked. "Not long," he said. "We respond within days." Days. Not weeks. Not months. Pressure was tightening. After ending the call, I returned to the documents spread across the table. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing inward with quiet urgency. That was when I noticed something new. A thin folder resting beneath the larger stack. Different from the others. Sealed. Untouched. I picked it up slowly, turning it over in my hands. Michael hadn't mentioned this one directly. Yet here it was. Waiting. Inside the folder, a single sheet rested alone. I unfolded it carefully. The words printed across the top stopped my breath completely. Deferred control asset. I read the line again. Then again. This asset existed outside the Manhattan property. Separate. Protected. Hidden intentionally. Which meant one thing. Everything I had believed to be the full inheritance was only the beginning. I set the paper back onto the table and stepped toward the window, staring out at the darkening skyline. Lights flickered on across the city, each window glowing against the gathering night. For years, I had believed survival meant staying quiet, staying patient, staying invisible. But now, something inside me had shifted. This was no longer survival. This was defense. Defense of trust. Defense of truth. Defense of everything Uncle Richard had built. My phone rang again. Late. Unexpected. Unknown number flashing across the screen. I stared at it for several seconds before answering. "Hello." Silence. Then a voice. Low. Unfamiliar. "You don't know what you're dealing with." The line went dead before I could respond. I lowered the phone slowly, the warning echoing in my ears. Across the table, the sealed folder rested beneath the kitchen light. Deferred control asset. Those words repeated in my mind as a new realization settled deep into my chest. The Manhattan building had never been the real prize. It had only been the beginning. Rain tapped steadily against the windows of Michael Bennett's office, each drop sliding slowly down the glass like time itself had thickened. The city outside looked blurred and distant, softened by gray skies and gathering fog. The sealed page from the back of the ledger lay on the desk between us. Different paper, different texture, stamped with a formal trust seal that pressed deeply into the surface like it carried weight beyond ink and words. Michael didn't touch it right away. Neither did I. "This was never meant to be opened unless the structure was challenged," he said quietly. The words settled into the room with unusual heaviness. Challenged. That was exactly what had happened. Carefully, he broke the seal. The sound of tearing paper felt louder than the rain outside. Inside were several folded sheets, thicker than standard legal documents. Michael opened them slowly, laying each page flat across the polished wood of the desk. I leaned forward slightly. "What is it?" I asked. He glanced up at me once before speaking. "The full structure," he said. "The part your uncle never disclosed openly." He turned the first page toward me. Rows of properties filled the document. Addresses, corporate names, investment accounts, legal entities layered across multiple states. I scanned the page once. Then again, my breath slowed as realization settled into place. This isn't just the building, I said. Michael shook his head. No, he replied. The Manhattan Building was the entry point. He tapped the paper lightly. Behind it sits a layered trust network. Multiple properties, investment holdings, corporate partnerships. The words echoed in my ears. Multiple properties. Not one, not two. An entire network. Invisible unless triggered, unless challenged. Which meant Uncle Richard had planned this long before anyone filed a lawsuit. The $88 million I had been left suddenly felt smaller. Not insignificant. Just incomplete. I sat back slowly in the chair, absorbing the scale of what lay before me. He knew they would come after this, I murmured. Michael nodded once. He prepared for it. He reached into the folder again and pulled out another sheet. This one looked different. Not technical. Not legal. Handwritten. My chest tightened slightly as he slid it toward me. Your uncle included a personal statement, he said. I picked it up carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable, sharp. Deliberate strokes I had seen countless times on grocery lists and labeled files. She listens before acting. The note read, She protects before speaking. The words blurred slightly as my eyes moved across the page. She understands patience, and she values responsibility. These qualities matter more than ambition. A slow breath escaped my lungs. For years, I had wondered if my quiet nature had made me invisible. Now I understood something different. It had made me trusted. Memories surfaced, long evenings spent reviewing documents with him, organizing stacks of receipts while others celebrated holidays or chased opportunities elsewhere. Small responsibilities, simple tasks, none of them dramatic, but all of them consistent. Michael tapped another section of the documents. There's more you need to understand, he said. I looked up. The Manhattan Building wasn't the final prize, he continued. It was the gatekeeper. Gatekeeper. Yes, he replied. Without control of that property, the rest of the trust remains inaccessible. My mind raced through the implications. If Daniel had gained control of the building, he wouldn't just have inherited one asset. He would have unlocked everything. The building had never been just property. It had been protection. Barrier. Shield. Michael turned another page and pointed to a timeline printed across the bottom. These are the transaction records tied to unauthorized access attempts. I leaned forward again. Names appeared beside each entry. Dates. Amounts. Digital pathways. Clear connections forming across months and years. And then I saw it. Daniel's name. Repeated. Not suspected. Confirmed. Every attempt tied back to him. Not Lorraine. Not secondary accounts. Him. Some of the dates aligned with periods when Uncle Richard had been hospitalized, times when he was physically vulnerable, dependent on others to manage routine responsibilities. A slow heat spread through my chest. Not anger. Not rage. Something colder. Something steadier. Betrayal. Clear and undeniable. Michael spoke quietly. If we present this evidence correctly, they cannot win. The certainty in his voice steadied something inside me. Not hope. Confidence. For the first time since the funeral, I felt the ground beneath me settle into something solid. My phone buzzed softly on the desk. Michael glanced at the screen. Court date confirmed, he said. When? Soon. Too soon. Pressure tightened again. But differently now. Not suffocating. Sharpening. Preparation had become survival. Later that evening, I found myself standing once again inside the Manhattan Building. The lobby felt quieter than before, the light softer against the polished floors. A security guard near the entrance straightened slightly when he saw me, offering a respectful nod. Something had changed. Not in the building. In perception. I walked slowly across the lobby, letting my hand brush lightly against the stone wall near the directory. Cold. Solid. Enduring. This place held history, not just business records. Trust. Responsibility. Protection built across decades. I stood there for several seconds, breathing in the quiet hum of the space. For years, this building had existed as background noise in family conversations, mentioned casually, dismissed easily. Now I understood its true role. It had been the first line of defense, and I was standing inside it, alone, but not unprepared. As I turned toward the elevator, the reflection of my own face caught briefly in the polished metal doors. Calmer than I expected, stronger than I remembered. For the first time since Uncle Richard's funeral, clarity replaced confusion. They thought they were fighting for money, for property, for status. But standing there in the silent lobby, I realized something far more important. I wasn't fighting for wealth. I was fighting for the truth he trusted me to protect. And tomorrow, the entire family would finally learn how wrong they had been. The morning of the hearing arrived colder than I expected. I stood outside the courthouse steps with my coat pulled tight around me, watching my breath drift into the air in soft white clouds. The sky above hung low and gray, pressing down on the city like it understood what this day meant. This was the day everything would be decided, not just legally, personally, emotionally. Across the wide stone steps, I saw them gathered near the entrance. Daniel stood slightly apart from the others, his posture rigid, his face drawn tighter than I had ever seen it. Lorraine remained beside him, her purse clutched firmly against her side. Fingers locked around the strap as if letting go would mean losing control entirely. For a moment, no one spoke. We simply looked at one another. Not like family, like opponents. I took a slow breath and walked forward, climbing each step with steady footing. The courthouse doors opened with a heavy pull, and the sound echoed sharply through the tall hallway beyond. Inside, the air felt still, quiet in the way only serious places ever are. We entered the courtroom together but separated immediately, each moving toward opposite tables. I sat beside Michael Bennett, placing my hands neatly in front of me, forcing them to remain still. Daniel glanced toward me once. Just once. There was no smirk this time. No confidence. Only tension. "You still have time to settle," he whispered under his breath as he passed behind me. I didn't answer, because there was nothing left to negotiate. The judge entered moments later, and the entire room rose as one. The sharp sound of chairs shifting filled the space before silence returned again. Michael stood first. His voice carried calm authority as he began presenting the case. Document after document appeared on the screen, ledger pages, security logs, timestamps carefully aligned into a timeline that told the story more clearly than words ever could. Every movement of every dollar, every attempt to access accounts, every failed intrusion. Proof. Clear and undeniable. Daniel's attorney tried to interrupt once, questioning the accuracy of specific entries. The judge leaned forward slightly, studying one transaction more closely. That pause stretched longer than any moment that day. My heartbeat slowed. Not racing. Waiting. Then the judge nodded once. "Continue," he said. Michael resumed. More documents followed. Then came the final presentation, the trust structure itself. Layered protections built over decades. Locked authority chains. Safeguards designed not for convenience, but survival. Michael explained each layer carefully, outlining how the trust prevented unauthorized control regardless of legal pressure. Even now, even here, the judge reviewed the final document slowly, adjusting his glasses before speaking. "The trust remains valid," he said. 4 words. That was all. But they carried the weight of everything that had happened. Lorraine's shoulders dropped visibly. Daniel stared straight ahead, unmoving. Michael continued only briefly after that, presenting the final evidence, records linking Daniel directly to unauthorized access attempts during periods when Uncle Richard had been hospitalized. Moments when trust should have been protected. Instead, it had been tested. The judge reviewed the last page, then set it aside. Silence filled the courtroom again. Not tense. Still. Final. "The will stands," the judge said. Another pause. The trust structure stands. A longer pause. And operational control remains with Margaret Calloway. For a second, I didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't react. Because the words felt unreal, like something spoken in a dream. Then the sound of chairs shifting broke the silence, and reality settled firmly into place. It was over. Outside the courthouse, the sky had changed. Clouds had parted slightly, letting sunlight slip through in narrow beams that touched the steps with quiet warmth. Daniel and Lorraine exited ahead of me, walking quickly without turning back. There was no confrontation, no apology, no final words, just distance. And somehow, that felt like closure. Michael walked beside me as we reached the sidewalk. "You did exactly what he hoped you would," he said quietly. I nodded once, unable to find words that matched the moment. Later that afternoon, I returned to the Manhattan building one final time. The doors opened smoothly as I stepped inside. And this time, the lobby didn't feel heavy or unfamiliar. It felt steady, ordered, alive. Thomas stood behind the desk, straightening when he saw me. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Calloway," he said. There was respect in his voice now. Not hesitation. Not doubt. Respect. I walked slowly across the marble floor, taking in every detail, the polished surfaces, the soft hum of lights overhead, the quiet movement of staff working with calm efficiency. At the far wall, a maintenance worker carefully replaced the brass nameplate beside the directory. Calloway Management. Clear. Centered. Permanent. I stepped into the archive room once more. This time, the door stood fully open. No shadows. No locked cabinets. Just order. Transparency. Closure. I ran my fingers lightly along the edge of the metal cabinet where the ledger had once rested. The cold surface felt solid beneath my touch. Reliable. Like truth itself. Eventually, I made my way upstairs to the office overlooking the street below. The city stretched endlessly beyond the windows, cars moving steadily, people crossing sidewalks, life continuing without pause. For years, I believed strength meant staying quiet, remaining patient, enduring what others overlooked. But standing there now, I understood something deeper. Strength wasn't loud. It wasn't forceful. It was consistent, prepared, quiet until the moment it mattered most. Uncle Richard hadn't given me wealth. He had given me responsibility, trust, proof that patience isn't weakness, it's preparation. And sometimes, the people who are underestimated the most are the ones who carry the greatest strength. If you've ever been in a room where people thought you didn't belong, if you've ever been dismissed, overlooked, or quietly pushed aside, then you understand exactly what this journey feels like. Maybe your story isn't about money. Maybe it's about respect, about truth, about finally standing tall after years of being underestimated. If this story reminded you of your own journey, or someone you know who had to fight quietly for what was theirs, I'd love to hear about it. Share your thoughts below. Tell me what moment changed everything for you. And if stories like this, stories about resilience, justice, and turning the tables when it matters most, speak to you, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel, because sometimes the most powerful victories are the ones no one sees coming.